And I'm Jen.
And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. This, ladies and gentlemen, and anyone else who is listening, is an attempt to recreate 45 minutes of brilliant audio that Jen and I put down about a week ago. But what had happened is that apparently my computer decided not to use the microphone, and so we recorded 45 minutes of silence, and we were so depressed.
Well, and 45 minutes of Jen talking to herself.
True, this is true. We could have just released that as like 45 minutes of you being brilliant by yourself.
And they could have filled in the other half of the conversation themselves.
Or I could have like live tweeted along with the audio and then maybe recreated all the things that we were saying. But anyways,
that would have been next time.
We're going to do our very best to recreate what it is that we lost. The good news is that you guys have no idea what we said the first time.
But that it's, brilliant, obviously. And it has to do with our listener discussion. That is what we were trying to talk about. All of the lovely feedback that you all have been giving us and the different ways that you've been engaging in conversation with us about this book so far. And that is what we were trying to discuss and would like to try to discuss again this time.
Absolutely. And so with that said, we've gotten a bunch of feedback on Twitter through direct messages and also just through tweets using the hashtag. Thank you for continuing to do that. We've also gotten some emails. And for those of us that have known each other for a while, there's also been some in-person discussion and there has been some texting back and forth, and so we have a great deal to discuss today and we will get right to it. But there were a couple things that we thought, based on the feedback we were getting, y'all ought to know about the way that we look at fiction and that we look at books before we go any farther, just so as you are listening to our feedback, to your feedback, you understand the perspective that we come from when we read fiction, and specifically when we analyze fiction and what fiction is or is not doing.
Right. And so we have 3 little short topics that we're going to talk about. The first 2 they're related to each other, and they are basically ways of interpreting authorial intent. And so when I read a book, the way that I read it is I interpret it with a method that usually people call death of the author. And that basically means that when an author releases a work out into the world, that's it. Whatever is in it is in it. Whatever they meant to put in it but didn't doesn't matter. And their intentions in writing it can be somewhat fluid depending on what is actually there represented in the text when I'm reading it. So essentially, the metaphor that I would use is like the author writes a book, and that's basically like running a race. So they do all this preparation beforehand. They work out, they do research, they take care of their health, they run the race is over, okay? And regardless of what they meant to do when they were running or things they wish they could have done better, or, whether they were successful or not, really is irrelevant because they've released the book and the race is over. So they can take all of those things into their next work, but as far as it affecting how I interpret what they've written, I kind of take any extra textual information they've given a little bit with a grain of salt. So for example, in this book, if Deborah were to come out and explain something from the book, or say that, she meant for a character to be representative of, X, Y, and Z, whatever. If I can look at the text and say, yeah, that's definitely in there, and, that's a unique and interesting way of viewing it that is supported by the text, that I can get behind, and it kind of increases my understanding and increases my enjoyment of the work, then I will, consider it to be part of the text. But if they come out and say something, I'm like, that may have been what you intended, but it's really not there for me. I go back and read it and I don't find it to be represented in the work. Then I'm just kind of like going to put it to the side. Like, it's nice information to have, but it doesn't really change the way that I read the book.
Right. And I tend to subscribe to that as well. And I think that as authors go, I think that so far what I've seen from Deb has been not to the extreme. There are authors, J.K. Rowling and Diana Gabaldon, to name a few, who are not only have a tendency to try and add to the work extra textually, but are also very hostile to the idea that people see or read things in their work that they quote unquote did not intend to be there. And that becomes really problematic because I subscribe to the theory that art is art and art is meaningful. And the reason that it is meaningful is because once you release it into the world, you have very little control over it. And so long as in a work of fiction, there is evidence in the text, meaning there is a word or a phrase or a scene or an idea that is captured on the page, and you can point to it and give me a citation, and you can build a theory off of that, I'm going to be interested in it and intrigued by it, and I will engage with it. But if it is coming from, say, an author's tweet or a talk that they gave, that might enhance my understanding of the environment in which the book was created. It tells me what the kitchen looked like when they were making the dish, but it doesn't necessarily change the way that I view it. Now, in some circumstances, I actually think that the extra textual information can ruin a book for me, and that often has to do with that hostility to understanding and interpretation, or the hostility to criticism that comes from not wanting to engage with somebody else's understanding of what your work is doing.
Right. And I find using death of the author to be a really nice way of approaching fiction, because I think a lot of us grew up in a school environment where we were maybe reading a work and we were told exactly what we should be finding in that book and the ways in which we should be interpreting, themes and whatever else. And I find that to be really limiting. And I think, honestly, if I look back on it, I think that's a lot of the reason why a lot of people end up being turned off to fiction and literature, is because they're told how to read it and how to interpret it, and they're told that if they see something that has not been, explicitly outlined in, whatever analysis, that it's wrong. And I think that's really tragic in a way. So I'm not going to come and say to Kate that I was reading All Souls and I really think that it's a commentary on space travel, and come up with this whole theory that is absolutely not in the text, and come to Kate and say, I think that's really what Deborah was trying to do, and this is how I'm going to read it, and I think it's about aliens and space travel. And Kate's going to look at me like I've maybe lost my marbles. Of course, that being said, if anyone has found any evidence of space travel in the text and has some textual support for that, please let us know. But so it is interpretation within reason. It does need to be actually in the book. You can't just go off and make things up that aren't actually there.
Although, to be fair, I would probably read Matthew and Diana in space.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. If that was like somebody write that fanfic, or if we had a little side series that was them in space, sure, I'd read that.
Yeah, I'd certainly read it, but I don't think that in the framework of these 3 books that has any grip, shall we say. I don't think there's any traction for that idea. I think it's also interesting for Death of the Author, when an author comes back and tries to retcon or retroactively construct an interpretation or an understanding of a prior book. So there is a distinction, of course, between interpreting a book and interpreting a series, and certainly interpreting books that are yet to be born that are in the same universe. But there is an extent to which authors will sometimes try to, in a 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th book, reach back in time to book 1, 2, or 3, and either add information or try to give you context in a way that becomes a successful or a not so successful retcon, depending on how they do it. And there are some successful ones in fiction, and there are some remarkably unsuccessful ones. And so I am less persuaded, of course, by ones that just try and make me think differently about something that, when you compare the 2 texts side by side, you're like, no, these can't exist in the same universe. In order for that to work, it has to be that the later thing sheds light on, illuminates, and changes your understanding of the earlier thing. It can't be that they're directly contradictory and the author is now just telling you how they want you to view the first thing, because maybe the feedback that they've gotten isn't what that they expected or wanted.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Right, and perhaps it just means that the author has a great deal more sympathy for, say, a character that they want you to like or they want you to empathize with than you do, and they try and retroactively make you feel the way that they feel about the character. And if it didn't work the first time, or if you didn't actually... It's one thing to intend to write something the way that you intended it is quite another for it to carry its own weight when it comes time to read and interpret and understand. So now that we have discussed death of the author and authorial intent, it is a good time to move into truth is no defense for fiction. And the meaning of that is really that every piece of art and every piece of writing is an act of construction and therefore an act of selection, because there's no novel, no matter how quote-unquote realistic it might be, that can accurately capture the texture and the dimensionality of the real world, which means that authors, when they choose to portray something, they are doing something. They are curating the world that they are letting you see, because you can't possibly convey everything about a mood, a sensation, a place, a person with one set of words on the written page. And so with that comes the understanding that if an author chooses to write something into a book and it is not the way that it would appear in the real world, there ought to be a reason for it, or perhaps there's a better way of saying it, in that if you put something in just to make your book more quote-unquote realistic, you are engaging in a process of editing that can actually be quite harmful. And I'll go ahead and dive into the example that many people use to talk about this phenomenon. It is one thing, for instance, to write a fantasy novel that is set in a quasi-Middle Ages type time frame or universe. And yes, in the Middle Ages, they had very different ideas about consent and appropriate sexual behavior, and of course sexual assault and rape. However, just because you set a book in the Middle Ages does not mean that every female character you have needs to be raped or needs to be threatened with rape to show that it was realistic for someone of that character in that time period to be threatened by sexual assault. Because then what you are doing, especially if you choose to do that and have it have no consequences, is you are simply building an environment and building violence into your story that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And so you can't defend putting a lot of sexual assault into a book by saying, well, that's just the way it was. Because guess what? You're writing fiction. It can be any way you want it to be. It can literally be any way you want it to be. And so if you put something odious in there, you need to reckon with it. And I think that that's different than books that, for instance, have not aged especially well. That's, I think, a very, very different thing, because you can certainly look back on a book that was written even 10 years ago and note that it has some problems with it that are based on a different understanding of, say, equality or consent or any number of things that we would find to be troubling today. Absolutely. But if you choose to put something in there that is harmful, or you choose to put something in there that is if you put something in there, you need to have it carry some weight. You need to have it do work, because otherwise the fact that you say that, well, that's how is in real life, isn't really going to be a defense for what you've done on the pages of the novel.
Right. And I think the other half of that is that, so we have, on the one hand, reality is no defense for fiction. On the other hand, it's not a condemnation of fiction either. So and we're going to talk about this a little bit when we get to some of our listener feedback, if an author puts something in the work that is contrary to our real life reality, they're likely doing it hopefully for, a plot or a character reason. And it is a work of fiction, and therefore it is okay for them to diverge from our reality in a work of fiction. And if I look at a book and I say, that's not what would happen in real life, that's okay, because I'm reading a book, it's fiction, and I'm not coming to it for historical accuracy or, any of those things. If I were, I would be reading nonfiction. So yeah, it's kind of a two sides to that argument, which I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about with this book.
Absolutely. And there's something else to it too, I think, which is to say that when something is not what you expect it to be in a fictional work, and that may be because maybe the protagonist has a profession that you also have, and you're like, oh, well, that's not the way law works. That's okay. And if it ends up throwing you out of the book, and if it ends up being a real impediment to your ability to engage with it, then that's absolutely a valid criticism of the book not portraying something in a way that helps you engage with it. Like, that's absolutely a valid reaction to have to with a book. For me, it doesn't always throw me out. It certainly can. And it's just one of those places that I come back and I sort of say, well, can I take this or do I need to leave it? And if you need to leave it, you need to leave it. That's totally fine. Your mileage on this kind of stuff is going to vary wildly depending on the kind of reader you are, the kind of emotional reaction you have to the book, whether you're engaged in the actual plot of the book to begin with. So,
yeah. And I feel like, too, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times the ways in which we can get thrown out of fiction is because we haven't been necessarily properly primed for whatever it is that the author is trying to get us to buy into. So if you're writing in a fictional world, especially in a fantasy world where you're literally like making stuff up that's just, whatever's coming out of your head, in order to get the reader's buy-in, and this is the same in movies and any storytelling medium, in order to get the readers or the watchers buy-in, you need to prime them to be prepared for something that you're going to present them with in this world. For example, if I'm reading a fantasy story, watching something on TV that has dragons in it, and if I come to the point where the dragons show up and I'm like totally surprised and I'm like, what? There are dragons in? Like, that makes no sense, and it totally kicks me out. It's because whoever wrote the story didn't prepare me ahead of time for the fact that there would be a potential for dragons to show up in their story.
Exactly. And there's also the sense in which when we are reading fiction, particularly speculative fiction, particularly fiction in which, say, witches and vampires and time travel exist, asking it to display a certain amount of realism, as in, like, well, this isn't how it would be in the real world. You are now in a world where witches and vampires and time travel exist, so it also can't look exactly like the world we actually inhabit anyway. So perhaps that is, at least that is the way that I come to it, and I sort of say, I don't really care if this detail or that detail is out of place, so long as the rest of the folds of the plot and the story and the characterization hang nicely for me. I'm not going to have that much issue with it. Which I guess brings us to the first batch of our listener feedback. There are actually a lot of people who are sort of taken aback by Deb's use of science and or her interaction with scientists and her portrayal of scientists in particular. There are people who contacted us who said, I don't like that she makes scientists seem like we're all super solitary, like we don't have friends, like we spend all of our times in the lab. And I'm not satisfied that, well, let me back up. I think I have two reactions to that. And the first is, I'm interested to hear that because it doesn't bother me at all. It could be because I'm an attorney. But the second part of it is, I think that within the frame of the book, she is building a world in which it is certainly possible for a scientist, not all scientists, to exist in a place where they do some solitary work, they do some collaborative stuff that they can be sort of engaged in, maybe correspondence, sharing of ideas, or they can work on grants mostly by themselves, or maybe they don't need a huge team, or there are any number of ways in which you could potentially construe science, or at least construe Matthew's brand of science as not being terribly social, and I think that's okay for me. That works for me.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think for me, it does not throw me out of the story because I think it works well from a character's perspective for Matthew. And I can definitely understand for people who are scientists, when you're reading a book, you really want to, find something that you can identify with in that work. You're drawn to a story because something in it is speaking to you. And so if it's from a professional standpoint, if they're working in your profession, of course you want it to be represented in a way that's satisfying to you, just in terms of, like your identity being tied up in that particular part of the fiction. And I think we mentioned before in this podcast how Deb has used her profession as a historian really well to enrich her story and to provide a lot of texture for us as readers. If that were not there, it wouldn't bother me either, because again, I'm reading a work of fiction, but because Diana is a historian, I think it works well from a character perspective to have that in there. Because Matthew is a vampire, I think for me, the way I interpret it is that he is more of a recluse, that he is more of a solo scientist. And I would just contrast that with our introduction of Chris, where we have him working with a lab full of graduate students when we first meet him as a character in his chapter. So I'm not sure that I agree that the book is making the argument that all scientists are reclusive, just that Matthew is. And I think that works well for his character. Not to mention the fact that he has just all the money in the entire world. And if he wants to squirrel himself away in a private lab and do research,
Absolutely. I think there's also something to be said for the portrayal of, say, Marcus as a doctor, right, who's much more engaged with other people. And I think as a character note, the solitary version of Matthew works for me because one of the larger theses I have about Matthew is about how falling in love with Diana is one of the ways in which he begins to re-engage with time. And he begins to be present again in his own story in a way that he hasn't been for several centuries, or at least in many, many ways. And so I would agree that I don't think that it is about all scientists being like Matthew. I think Matthew's version of being a scientist is quite reclusive. We know very little about the lab in which Miriam works, but perhaps Miriam just likes to work with other vampires, period, because that seems to be her thing. And it is a valid response to have to the book, and I can understand how if someone were a scientist by trade, they might have that kind of a reaction to this portrayal. Again, it didn't particularly strike or bother me because that is not my profession, and it is not, while it is interesting feedback to have, it is not feedback that I necessarily share about the story.
Right. And I would love to, when we get to book 3, I think we can complete this discussion, like you said, of Matthew re-engaging with time, especially as a scientist. And I would love to just put a little tack in this conversation and hear back from our scientists in the audience when we get to book 3 and how much his character changes in terms of his engagement with the world of science and with the other people who are scientists in the book.
That is an excellent idea, and I won't say I'd forgotten about that. I had not gotten to the point where I was closing the loop on where that would end, so well done you.
I only thought of it because I accidentally started book 3 after I accidentally finished book 2 and book 1, so...
That's okay. That's what good stories do to you.
I've been reminded of this.
Excellent. So we had some other feedback from people about our response to Sarah and M. So there were 2 topics. There was one about representation in there, and then the other was about the view that the book takes with respect to Sarah and M and how that might be affected by Diana's perspective. So one of our lovely listeners got back to us and said, well, you've been talking about how this book exists in a couple different timelines, one of them being when it was written and the other being when we're reading it, and then also the fictional timeline of the book. And the timeline that we are forgetting is Diana's personal timeline of when Diana grew up. We find out in book 1 that Diana was born in 1976. August 13th, 1976 to be precise. And our listener pointed out that perhaps Diana's views of same-sex relationships and being in a household with a same-sex relationship might have been shifting at the same time, and that's why we have that somewhat clunky and awkward character introduction for Sarah and M. What do you think?
So we find out Diana's actual birth date in the next reading. As of this podcast, our next reading group, I believe in chapter 13 is when we find out her actual birth date. And so in Sarah and M's character introduction in 1 through 3, whatever chapter they were in, chapter 2, I think, or chapter 1, we have no idea when Diana was born, really. So I like that idea, and I enjoy thinking about whether or not Diana growing up would have had to have made, excuses and allowances and be a little bit defensive about their relationship. It doesn't quite fit for me, just in terms of the storyline and the things that we know about Diana's character up until this point. But I enjoyed thinking about it very much.
And I think that even if that were the case, I think that especially when you compare that discussion of Sarah and M with the later discussion of Sweet William and Hamish, that one of the things that speaks to me about the contrast between those two scenes is just the authorial security and confidence. And it is not so much what Deb has to say about Em and Sarah that I find to be somewhat stumbly. It is the manner in which it is done. Now, there certainly is some tropiness, and one of our other listeners got in touch and said that it didn't bother them because they thought it was maybe sort of a tongue-in-cheek, like the granola lesbian witch thing, at least, like, no, they're actually witches, tee-hee.
Yeah.
And I can totally see that. I can see that as being a way to look at these two characters, and that has a little bit of traction for me. But with respect to Diana's perspective, I think that what really sort of niggles me about that paragraph is just that it could be done so much cleaner, and it could be done with a much lighter touch, the way that Deb is certainly capable of doing, and that just hasn't happened in this book.
And I'm not completely ready. I'm still like holding on to the idea, because I think later in this book there are a couple of other instances where Diana's talking about Sarah and M's relationship, and I would like to compare those times to this initial introduction and kind of see how that tracks through the book. So I'm interested to see how that idea carries on along through the book. Currently, right now in the book, it doesn't work for me, but I think potentially by the time we get to the end, I might be buying into it. I'm not sure.
And I think that part of it is just the idea that when you are doing any of this kind of world building work, you should tell your story walking, and I think that Deb does a much better job of that as she gains confidence, as she gains in skill, because her skill as an author improves immensely from book 1 to 3 just by working those muscles, right? She has a much lighter hand and a much more developed sense of where she's going, and she doesn't spend a lot more time in an exposition, except for when it comes to furniture. She has a thing for furniture. She talks about it a lot, but it's okay because there are other authors who also engage in a certain amount of either historical or scenic tourism, and that is completely fine. There are a lot of rugs and chairs. Lots of rugs and chairs.
Rugs, chairs, pictures, hangings, tapestries.
It's basically like a really nice auction vomited into
the book.
Isabeau's house,
yes,
or Matthew's house. But we can get to those chapters when we arrive. And so I think that where I come down on the stuff about Sarah and M is that I think that even if that were the case, if we were seeing it from some kind of a complication of Diana's perspective, that it could still be done more gracefully than it is in that somewhat stodgy paragraph and a half where it's originally introduced. And I also think that the hey look, they're actually witches thing could certainly work for me. I think I'd have to wait and sort of chew on that one a little bit longer.
And I think that ties a little bit into our discussion we were going to have about representation in the books. One of our listeners, and actually someone we've known for a long time and good friend of ours, messaged us and brought to our attention, I think it was a quote from Deborah about Miriam and Miriam's origins and as a character, and the way that she intended for Miriam to be represented in the book. And that is that Miriam is supposed to be from... I do not remember.
Oh, she says that Miriam is basically from the Levant, that she is either of Arab descent or of Middle Eastern descent, and some description.
Okay, yes. So, and that textually does not work for me. And I appreciate the intent, and I appreciate Deborah wanting to make her characters more representative, but all that we know of Miriam up to this point is that she is short, she is feisty, she has dark hair, and she was at one point in Jerusalem. Really. And that's all we know. And that's almost all we ever get about Miriam's character or her origins. And so for me, textually, it does not work. But I appreciate the knowledge.
Right. And I think that for me, one of the problems potentially with the talk of representation, and particularly the talk about Miriam's origins, is that there is some ambiguity, at least in this text, about where Miriam comes from, and the idea of representation being one that has to do with trying to present the world in some ways as it is, which is to say that there are people of different shapes, sizes, colors, origins, orientations, religions, etc., that there is diversity in the world, unless you are explicitly writing some variety of speculative or alternative reality fiction in which there is none and everyone is all the same, etc., that when you build in representation, you have to think about how you are doing it and think about whether the ambiguity serves the story or whether it doesn't. And there's some really interesting articles about ambiguity and the race of characters in particular in sort of quasi-realistic worlds. In fact, when the stage production of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child happened a couple years ago, and they cast a black actress to play Hermione, there was a portion of the internet that melted, and there was a portion of the internet largely represented by J.K. Rowling's fandom of color, essentially, that cheered because it was ambiguous in the book. And so to have that representation and to have that understanding made canonical, or at least accepted as an interpretation of the canon, was important. But there was a great article, and I wish I could find it, I have been looking, about how that racial ambiguity is really dangerous for readers of color in particular, just because they don't want to have their hearts broken and they don't want to be betrayed, essentially, by you not necessarily having the guts to write a character of color, but leaving it ambiguous and open to interpretation. But 9 times out of 10, the people who interpret it are going to assume that the character is white, and they're going to put a white character in there when perhaps that's, I think that especially for Hermione, and this is a discussion for a different podcast, but the understanding of Hermione as a character of color is actually really powerful, like super powerful if you go back and read the books, especially when Draco is getting into that awful mudblood, Muggleborn stuff. Like, that adds a depth and an intensity to that plot line that isn't there if Hermione is white. And therefore, I think that these kinds of things, if you intend to do them, then do them. Like, just have the confidence to do them. And if you don't, you don't. And maybe then we can have a discussion about the diversity or lack thereof in a book. But the ambiguity doesn't serve.
Right. And actually, so for the television show, our upcoming TV show that we're very excited about for this book, the actress who has been cast to play Miriam is a gorgeous and delightful woman of color who I'm very excited to be seeing in the show. And actually, the casting overall for that show, I think, has been, to me, as a white girl, really diverse, and I'm excited about it. And so in that way, I think Deborah's intention for that character, while it might not be present in the book, will be able to be represented in the show, which is very exciting, and an interesting kind of separation between the textuality of the show and the textuality of the book.
Absolutely. And I think that it's worth something to have the conversation about who is portrayed as this, that, and the other. And it's certainly not to say that every white author should try to populate their books with a bunch of hollow characters of color. And by that, I mean, there are some things that writing from my skin and trying to make a character with another skin tone, I'm never going to get right. And there are some aspects in which I should try and fail. And there are some aspects in which I should leave it alone and leave it for for an author of color writing a character of color to discuss or to engage with. And so I think that that's really an interesting conversation to have, so long as we continue to have it with the understanding that if Deb intended to make Miriam Levantine, for lack of a more specific descriptor, then why not just do it? Why not just say something that indicates that Miriam is? because the intent just doesn't carry
Anything.
into the page.
Anything.
And there's certainly there is more diversity in the series, especially by the time we get to book 3. There are definitely more and more people who start to pop up from different corners of the globe. But I think that our primary, if I recall correctly, I think our primary comment on that was that a lot of those characters are sort of in the background. There isn't a lot of engagement with the plot and with the two main characters in the central narrative from people who are different than Matthew and Diana until I think you really get, well, until you have Chris there in person, right? Or you get to say like a Fernando.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is in book 3.
Right, exactly. So you spend a lot of time. You spend a lot of time with essentially lots of very pale people doing pale people things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
So I think that takes us into talking about something else that we've been chewing on for weeks, which is the idea of Matthew and the toxic masculine. And that's a big one. That is one that I think that we will engage with and struggle with for the duration of the series, not just this book. And so we had a very lengthy email from one of our listeners about Matthew and the idea of toxic masculinity. And for those of you who don't really know about toxic masculinity, it is a term that is often used in criticism or in feminism to talk about the idea that traditional masculinity can be extraordinarily harmful, not only to men, but also to women and to people when it is perpetuated in pop culture. And that is characterized by an excess of violence, domineering behavior, the sort of lack of emotion unless it is anger or lust, a certain amount of just patriarchal intent and attitude. It's a lot. So there's a fantastic article that we can link to in the show about, say, Logan as a toxic masculine character and why it is so dangerous and damaging to have that kind of hero narrative played out over and over again, both as a model for men and what it is acceptable for men to do to women. And
we mean Logan as in Wolverine.
Correct.
Yes.
Logan as in Wolverine. And
yes, X-Men.
I think that there are a lot of arguments to be made for Matthew as a toxic masculine figure and a lot of conversations to be had about the interaction between the toxic masculine and the vampire trope to begin with.
Yeah. And I think, and we were able to engage on Twitter as well as through email in this discussion, and it was definitely in two parts. Part of it with Matthew as potentially a toxic masculine figure, and the other part being the vampire mythology in fiction being used as an excuse for abusive behavior, which I think is a really important conversation to have. I should start this off by saying that there are times in the book when I think Matthew is being ridiculous and awful. I do not find him to be a representative of a toxic masculine figure because I think that idea shines a light on half of his character while ignoring the other half of his character. And while I think it's really, really important to discuss the very difficult and problematic and troublesome aspects of his character, I think that he has a lot that redeems him and keeps him from being that kind of character. Now, there are other characters in these 3 books that I would absolutely agree are toxic masculine characters that I find to be reprehensible when they show up in the book. And Baldwin. Not to name drop or anything. He is my least favorite character, and he will show up later in this book. And then I think we'll be able to have a fuller discussion, kind of like comparing and contrasting Matthew to some of the other male characters that show up in this series.
Sure. And I think that for me, I agree with you that if we focus only on the toxic aspects of Matthew, we are not focusing on some of his better qualities, but we're also not getting a full view of him. And I think that there's a lot that Deborah does to contextualize some of his mannerisms and behaviors that help us understand him. We haven't gotten to it in the reading yet, but, so much of Matthew is driven by grief and loss and a sense of responsibility and consequence that when you talk about Matthew and if you look at the model sort of what the toxic masculine is or how it's portrayed, the lack of emotion, I think, is something that Matthew directly rebuts. And there are versions of toxic masculinity where you talk about, well, the only emotions that a masculine character is allowed to have are basically anger, lust, and brooding. And we certainly have all of those things with Matthew, but I think that erases his humor, his joy, his empathy, his respect for Diana, which is sometimes more problematic than it ought to be, just because our reader who sent us this feedback and I had a discussion where we talked about how many of the worst times in the book are when Matthew essentially does this thing, which we've subtitled, like, Matthew does patriarchal vampiric stuff, takes Diana's agency, blames it on being a vampire, right? Like, that's when the stuff is really, really worth talking about as, like, this is not a great thing to do. And there's actually a major plot point in this book that I fundamentally disagree with that we will get to in probably 10 chapters. But that being said, I think that to discuss it only as toxic masculine and not to discuss what contextualizes Matthew and what makes Matthew whole is to sort of flatten him as a character.
Right. And I feel like if Matthew was only the brooding and the anger and the possessiveness and that behavior, then he would be a problem. But we've just had this lovely discussion of him at Hamish's house and the amount of vulnerability that he has in that chapter. And we discussed that in our podcast, which has been released, that episode. His remorse and his guilt for the things that he has done is really important for him as a character, because without that, then we are just in another abusive vampire story.
Absolutely. And there's also an extent to which over the course of the series, I think you can make an argument for each character having, or Diana and Matthew having, these internal character arcs that have to do with, like, the larger story is really about Diana getting her stuff together, Matthew getting his stuff together, Matthew and Diana getting their stuff together so that they can see what a life together as the two of them living their fullest, most authentic lives looks like what it looks like to make and build a family that has two such complicated, powerful, interesting, and fundamentally sort of dangerous people in it. And you don't get to see as much of Matthew's arc in this book as you do in 2 and 3, when I think particularly in 2, the best and worst of Matthew is contextualized in really fantastic relief. Because except for some minor points, like, Diana sort of steps into being Diana in book 1, and for the most part, she is. There's still some change that happens, but it's not the same scale and scope of change, I think, as it is in the first book. And the second book is sort of Matthew engaging with the same thing.
Yeah, and this is definitely a conversation we are going to continue to have, that we've already started having, and that we're going to continue, through these books. And when we have our episode to kind of finish off this first book, I'm sure we're going to be talking about Matthew's arc again. Because he is a character that you definitely have to grapple with a bit and think about in a lot of very different and sometimes difficult ways.
And it's definitely worth having the conversation about the stuff that he does that is absolutely not okay. And we already talked a little bit about the sneaking in the rooms. And again, just to recap, I think that is mostly handled. I wouldn't necessarily say solved, but I would say mostly reconciled with the desire for the manuscript and the fact that he tells on himself to Hamish. That with those two things, he is recognizing that what he did isn't romantic and it's not okay. It's posited against, say, an Edward Cullen, who, of course, does that whether Bella wants him to
sneak into the room time and time again.
Whether Bella wants him to or not, he's just going to do it because he wants to do it. And he just sort of establishes himself as, like, a creepy fixture, whereas Matthew at least has a goal that isn't solely about eating Diana.
Right. Indeed. So I think it's safe to say we will continue on with that. And the other part about, vampire stories being a vehicle for abusive behavior, I am not really into a lot of other vampire fiction. And that is one of the primary reasons why. That vampire stories basically contain the violence and the abuse and the other behaviors, with it all wrapped up with a nice bow that says vampire, it's okay. And I'm like, no. And both male and female. There are, a lot of vampire stories with female characters that engage in really abusive behavior, and it's made to be okay because they are vampires. And I think it's really troubling in fiction, and I find that this series does not stray into that territory, and maybe sticks a toe in it once in a while.
For sure. And it engages with I think one of the things that Deborah generally does pretty well is that there are a couple times when Matthew uses Diana's fear to his advantage, and those are times we need to talk about. But generally speaking, her romanticization with Matthew, the way that she looks at Matthew isn't about the romance of his inherent capacity for violence. What she romanticizes, I think, far more is the idea of Matthew as an artifact of a time that is gone, and Matthew as a world-weary person out of time. And the only way to accomplish that without making him like a Dorian Gray type figure with a creepy-ass portrait, which is probably next to the rugs and the chairs, right? Without that is to make him a vampire in this context.
Yeah. And I think actually when we get to book 3, Deborah actually very nicely subverts that idea of the violent and toxic vampire in a way where this world roundly rejects that. And it's going to take a lot of character arc to get there. But I think that we end in a very nice place with that particular discussion.
So we'll stick a pin in that, keep talking about it, keep letting us know what you think, and whether that behavior, whether it throws you, how you felt about it, we would love to hear. We had some great comments about Diana, specifically about Diana and her stubbornness and her behavior as being really engaging for some readers who found that the book taking an approach to Diana where she doesn't quite know what's going on in herself, where she's kind of brittle and angry, actually works for them quite nicely. We have a tendency to sort of bop her on the head about it, but
we do.
There are other people that find it to be really persuasive and engaging.
And I think we're going to get less and less head boppy as we go along in the book. I think Diana in the beginning of the book she can be very challenging in the first probably quarter of the book, and she becomes more of an active character and more empowered as we go through, and therefore I find her to be less difficult as we get later on into this book.
By the time we get to book 3 in particular, I think that Diana is actually quite in charge of her own agency and her own being, and that's also part of the reason that the reckoning with Matthew takes so long, is that it just has to work itself out. And because the book chooses to solve the will they or won't they question relatively quickly, you suffer through a great deal of them figuring out right, you suffer through a great deal of them just figuring out how to be. Now the question, it's decided we will be together, but how do we do that again? So that's kind of what you deal with, and that means that you spend a lot of time sort of reconciling them to each other that you might have done earlier if this were a story where it was a will they or won't they.
Right. Yes. And we had one reader who brought up this lovely idea of Diana being a palimpsest herself, which I find to be delightful.
Oh, I thought it was lovely too.
That Diana is actively and against her own will a person within another person. Yes. And I find that to be delightful.
I love that too. I also love the idea that perhaps a discovery of witches is actually kind of like a cloud of cats, or any of those other funny animal group names. So I will always think of witches and groups as discoveries from now on.
There you go. I like that. I like it a lot. And we had talked about at one point, perhaps it was the last time we tried to record this, that a palimpsest is something that when you're talking about the actual book, that the old book has been forcibly erased and something else has been written over it. and but you can never really get rid of the original identity of the book, which I think works really well for Diana's character as well.
Oh, for sure. And I had completely forgotten about that comment, so I'm glad that you remembered it.
That was your comment from last time.
Well, I'm glad that you remembered it, because I did not make a memory of that.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, so I figured we should, impart that to our listeners as well.
I love the idea that just, Diana, talking about Diana and identity really makes my gears turn. So I think that it's a great thing to continue discussing as we go through this book. And I think that sort of covers most of our commentary that we've gotten over the past couple episodes. Please continue to send us your tweets and your emails and your messages. Oh,
sorry, we had one more thing that we forgot to talk about last time, but I'm bringing it up this time because I remembered, which was we were talking to a couple of people actually about the plot structure and the pacing of this book and how it is imperfectly paced and the structure is not ideal in some cases. And I actually have to say that for me, the pacing and plot structure in this book is the least troublesome for me. I think book two suffers a lot from pacing problems, and I think book 3 suffers a lot from some plot and pacing issues. So this book for me is like, out of the 3, I'm like, oh, this is a breeze. But I was just reading chapter 13 and 14, and the first half of both of those chapters, I'm like, what are we doing? Why is this here? Do we have to discuss the lab for 6 pages? Is that a thing that we have to do? So I absolutely see where people are coming from, finding it to be difficult. But I think Deborah really shines in other areas that are not necessarily plot and pacing.
Absolutely. And I think that the overall structure of the story works out quite nicely. Like, I think that she actually does the larger movement of the plot in terms of making things actually come together in a cohesive and digestible and meaningful storyline. I think that all of that work is really, really good. Like, it's a grade A. I think that in pacing, she sometimes gets to like B- C+ territory, especially in book 2, and in the structure, like sticking the landing, I guess, on a lot of the structure stuff, that's sometimes a B- too.
But those aren't necessarily the things. I mean, she does so many other things that are delightful to me that I am not often frustrated with the structure or the pacing. And I think you're right that the individual books suffer a little bit so that we can have the overall structure of the trilogy together, which I think is okay for me.
Absolutely. And we will certainly talk structure when we get to the end of this book, because I would actually end A Discovery of Witches earlier than it ends. I would end it probably 80, 90 pages before it actually ends, because I think Shadow of Night actually starts at the end of the text of Discovery of Witches. For me. Yeah.
And I would cut a good amount of Shadow of Night. So and we can, get to that discussion when we get there.
Like
but
next year.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with people who are reading this and are kind of like, oh, the pacing is killing me.
Yes. And again, I agree with you. That's not why I come to this party. I don't come to it for structure and pacing and for really exceptional narrative craft. I think there is some really great narrative craft in it, but I don't know that necessarily if we're going to do like a report card on all the things that you're supposed to have, that we would get top marks in all categories.
Yeah. I think her strengths really are, in developing the actual plot itself, not the structure, but the actual story itself, and the way the story unfolds, I think is really fascinating and interesting. And I think for the most part, all of the characters are very engaging and very complex and well developed. So I think those are more where, the strengths of the stories lie.
Excellent. Well, I think that is actually all of our feedback now. So thank you for engaging with us on Twitter and by email and all the other ways you've gotten in touch. You can continue to do so at Chamomile in Clove or at chamomileinClovecast@gmail.com, or you can also leave a comment on our website, chamomileandclovecast@wordpress.
Yes, and thank you all so much for your discussion thus far. We've really been enjoying it, even if we have come to the conclusion that we don't personally agree with some of the areas of the discussion. We've enjoyed, thinking about it and having this critical discussion about it, and we hope that you will continue to, share your views with us and have the discussion with us, because we've been really enjoying that. So, yes, thank you.
We welcome it. We relish it. We love it. I check that email account every day in hope and with faith.
Exactly. So until next time, until our next actual book episode, thank you so much for listening.
Good night. Thanks.
Bye.